Good evening and welcome to Edinburgh Jewish Cultural Centre Live. Tonight I'm interviewing Rabbi Mark L. Solomon. Mark is Senior Lecturer in Talmud, Rabbinics, Jewish Philosophy and Kabbalah at Leo Baeck College, London. He is also the part-time rabbi to Sukkot Shalom, Edinburgh's liberal Jewish community. He's also part-time rabbi to Leicester's liberal congregation. I'm delighted to have Mark with us tonight. And I'd like to start by asking you, Mark, what inspired you to become a rabbi?
That's a nice, easy question to answer. Thank you, David. It was my rabbi as a child in Sydney. Pardon me. His name is Raymond Apple, and he came to be rabbi at the Great Synagogue in Sydney in around 1974. So I would have been 11 then, I think. And he became my role model, my teenage hero, whatever. And I think I wanted to follow in his footsteps. It was around. Actually, I'm wondering now if he didn't come a couple of years earlier than that to Sydney, because I think I was a bit younger. And around that age, I began going to synagogue summer camps. We had our own youth group at the synagogue called GSY, Great Synagogue Youth, which was flourishing in those days, and had a summer camp. And that was really the first place where I saw a kind of daily rhythm of Jewish life. I mean, I grew up in a very Jewish household, but it was the first time we had Shacharit, Mincha, and Mariv, or at least Shacharit anyway, and Torah study during the day and benching after every meal. And the rabbi was there, and the rabbi's kids who were about my age, so we became friends. And the chazan's youngest son, who became a very close friend, he's now a chazan in London, as it happens. And so yeah, I became part of that whole environment. But it was Rabbi Apple, who was very, very distinct. Some people here might have come across his name or come across him in years gone by. He started, or he trained at Jews College, which is why I ultimately went there, and he became the rabbi of the Bayswater Synagogue, which no longer exists, and then the Hampstead Synagogue, which very much does, and then he was called to the rabbinate in Sydney. He effectively became Australia's sort of chief rabbi without the title, as it were. And he's long retired now, lives partly in Israel, partly in Australia, but he was a great inspiration to me. And so that's Rabbi Apple plus the GSY camps, I think, that together gave me that first impetus to think about being a rabbi.
And so before that, were you, as a family, regularly going to shul, synagogue?
Oh yeah, so very, very sort of traditional, but not frum. So my mother had all her life had been very attached to the synagogue, the Great Synagogue in Sydney, which is a magnificent cathedral synagogue. So she'd been in the choir all her life, which we'll probably talk about later, and worked in the synagogue office when she was a young woman, and sat on every committee there was and chaired every committee there was that women were allowed to. So yeah, my dad came from a less religious background, but my parents gave me a very strong Jewish upbringing. Went to Cheder on Sundays and Talmud Torah 2 days a week after school, and so forth. But they weren't from. They drove to shul, usual United Synagogue kind of thing. And it was about when I was about 10, 11, I decided I wanted to be really from like Rabbi Apple's children and so forth. And I started walking to shul on the sly, because I'd started going earlier and getting the bus to get there for the beginning of Shacharit, and most people turned up for, the Ein Kamocha halfway through. So I was getting the bus, and then instead of getting the bus, I'd walk in. It was about 5 miles, and I was only 11. So when my parents and people driving by would catch sight of me, and say, "Oh, we saw Mark walking to synagogue." So the cat was out of the bag, and My parents were furious. And I also started wearing a kippah to school on the sly as well. I'd put it on when I left the house and take it off when I came home so my parents wouldn't know. And one day I forgot my lunch, my packed lunch. So my mother brought it to school and found me wearing a yarmulke in the middle of the day. So again, that wasn't well received at home.
Can
But
I ask why were your parents furious?
it's hard to explain, I guess. I think my father, it was all a bit strange, unfamiliar. It wasn't the way he was brought up. It wasn't the world he knew. I was making myself stand out and making myself different, and he just didn't like it. I wasn't following in his footsteps at that point.
And what sort of reaction did you get at school wearing your kippah? I mean, were there lots of other Jewish kids at school?
Oh well, it wasn't a Jewish school. It was what in Britain would count as a grammar school, I suppose. It's called selective schools in Australia. But I think when I was in first form, there was one boy in sixth form who wore a kippah, but then he was gone the next year, and I was the only one for quite a few years. So I got a bit of mild bullying, nothing too drastic. You know, as anyone who knows me, which is a lot of the people here will know, I'm rather on the short side, to put it mildly. So I was going to get bullied anyway, regardless. So might as well, you know, add a centimeter of height on top. So, but the funny thing was, you know, I started wearing a black kippah, just a very, you know, small, unobtrusive black kippah. And then one day, for some reason, I wore a blue one instead. And one of the boys asked, "Have you been promoted?" Become a bishop overnight or something, you know.
I guess in London, someone might say, "Oh, have you started supporting Chelsea? Is that right? They playing group?"
Yeah.
Yeah. So you become frum, the only frummer in the house, and you go on to study at the yeshiva in Melbourne and then Kfar Chabad in Israel. Was that the first time you'd been to Israel?
No, it was the second time. So we'd had a family. Well, the synagogue had a trip to Israel. I think it was when I was in my final year at school, or just about, because they were inaugurating a forest on Mount Carmel that the synagogue, you know, in the name of the synagogue. I think it was in the name of Rabbi Israel Porush, who was the emeritus rabbi. And so there was an organized trip, and we went along, and then we stayed on a week or two longer as a family. And that was my first trip when I was 16, 17. And that was amazing, absolutely wonderful experience. So then going in 1983, that would have been my second time there. Yeah. And that was a very different sort of experience at that point.
The second time.
Yeah. Well, I was there to study. I was there for the best part of a year, but I was having quite a hard time with Judaism by then. So I was really struggling with the whole Jewish thing at that point, even though I was in a Lubavitch yeshiva. I actually went to Israel to study at Bar Ilan University, which is a religious university, as many will know, in Ramat Gan. But because the Australian year and the European year don't match up, so I got there, you know, in sort of January, February, and I had to wait till September for the academic year. So I ended up staying in Kfar Chabad for the several months and studying there. But I was really struggling with the teachings of Chabad, you know, the Lubavitch movement, which I'd been involved in for a few years by that time, and getting more and more involved, but also getting more and more troubled by some of the doctrines that lie at the heart of their sort of mystical approach, which was to do with the special nature of Jewish souls and how Jewish souls are totally different from non-Jewish souls. and I really struggled with that. And when I first encountered it when I was at school, we had a Lubavitcher rabbi, a lovely man, who came in to my high school one day a week and gave a shiur on the Tanya, on the holy book of Chabad. And these ideas are right at the beginning of the Tanya. You can't avoid it. How, you know, Jews have a spark of God within them, and that's, you know, other people don't, and various other things. I won't go into the grisly details, but I, you know, instinctively found it repulsive and racist, and I really struggled with it. And Lubavitchers are very familiar with people struggling with that. They know that it's a difficult issue, and they have all kinds of strategies for dealing with that, and responses, some of which are very profound and interesting. And for a while, I sort of accepted it to a point, but I kept on struggling with it. And by the time I got to Kfar Chabad, I was really struggling, and that's where it all came to a head. And I kind of rejected Judaism. But at the same time, I have to say that some of that struggle, which on the surface was about these religious ideas, was probably about my own insecurities and, you know, struggling with sexuality and all that sort of thing. And that was the way it expressed itself at the time.
So did you kind of withdraw and stop studying, or did it make you want to study wider, or what happened?
Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah, so I wanted to be a rabbi from about the age of 14. When I hadn't told my parents for a long while, because I didn't think they'd be that pleased given the way things were. But when I told Rabbi Apple, he made me very happy by saying, "Oh, I've been waiting for you to tell me that." But anyway, so that had been my goal for years and years. But and so that I gave up that goal effectively because of those spiritual struggles. So I was just turning 20 around that time, and wrote to Rabbi Apple about it, and so on and so forth. And when I got to Bar Ilan, instead of studying in their Jewish studies and rabbinic department at Bar Ilan, you could do half the day academic and half the day Kollel, which is Talmudic studies towards rabbinic ordination. So I didn't do that, and instead I started studying English there, which wasn't quite the right place for a native English speaker to be studying English, but it was quite fun for a while. But I was quite unhappy there at that time, and didn't really have friends and people I could confide in. So after a semester there, I went home to Australia, and then I went to university and did English and other things in Sydney.
And at that point, had you given up the idea of, or the aspiration to be a rabbi?
Yes, for that time, for about 4 years, that was in abeyance. I was still involved with the shul. I was, you know, rejoined the choir that I'd been singing in for years, and I was teaching in the cheder and all sorts of things, but yeah, not aiming anything more than that at that point.
Mm-hmm. And then what brought you back in, and what happened then? What was the path back in?
That's a slightly difficult thing to talk about, really, but I'll answer your question. I think I'd been struggling with my religious identity quite a lot throughout those 4 years, and exploring other paths, and really struggling with all of that. Not something I could tell my parents about or anything like that. But I wasn't really making progress. I was learning a lot in the process, but I wasn't really arriving at any sort of solution. And so I felt a bit stalled with it all. And then Rosh Hashanah, 1987, instead of just going in and singing in the choir, which I'd been doing anyway, I decided to go in for Shacharit, a couple of hours earlier, because Shacharit's very long on Rosh Hashanah. So I went in and I was just sitting there in shul. I didn't quite know why, but I just wanted to be there. So that was Rosh Hashanah. And then on Shabbat Shuvah, we used to have Mincha Mariv at the rabbi's house or the chazan's house. They lived in the same building, and we'd go along there on Shabbat afternoon and have Mincha and have a shiur and have a Sudah Shlishit and the Mariv. And I went along. I mean, I don't know why I did, but my parents went, so I went, and it was familiar, and I knew everybody. And I was there, and I was davening Mariv at the end of Shabbat Shuvah, and something just happened. One of those strange spiritual experiences that happen occasionally in your life. I was suddenly, I hadn't been praying properly. I was just there, kind of thinking my own thoughts. And then suddenly I was filled with a sort of overwhelming conviction that I had to be Jewish, that I could never be anything but Jewish, and that I had to be a rabbi. And it was difficult to explain, but it was a very deep experience, and that set me on the journey back, as it were. And within a fairly short time after that, I'd finishing university. I started working at the shul, doing all sorts of things, and then decided to apply to Jews College.
And so at Jews College, you studied to be an Orthodox rabbi, is that right? Or...
Yes, it was modern Orthodox college. When I first came, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs was principal. Had been for some years principal of Jews College, and so he was one of the teachers there. So I was privileged to sit in his philosophy classes. After my first year, he then went on leave to sort of prepare for being chief rabbi, as it were, which he became in 1991. But he'd sort of taken me under his wing because I'd done philosophy at Sydney as well as English. I did some philosophy, and so I was the one with my hand up, and I remember one occasion when he held up Dawkins' book, The Brief History of Time, which Stephen Hawking's book, sorry, I should say, The Brief History of Time, which had then just recently come out. And he said, "Who's read this? Has anyone read this?" And I said, "Yes, I've read it." I was the only one who'd read it. So he then said, "Now explain what he says."
Excellent. So, I mean, you've had quite a struggling journey. And then, if I may, we'll come to another big move in your journey as a rabbi, or to become a rabbi. So you trained and you were ordained in the Orthodox tradition, and then you moved to the liberal community, liberal tradition, and that was because you'd come out as gay. Can you tell us a bit about that, and what it was like?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you a lot about it, but we don't have days and days. So I'll try and keep it brief, and stop me if I'm going on too long. So that was a very, very tough time, and of course, growing up, I'd always been vaguely aware of issues to do with sexuality, but being involved with Chabad. The idea is, so they arrange a marriage for you and that will fix everything up. So that was fine. And then, human beings, we have a sort of infinite capacity for avoiding difficult issues and suppressing things we don't want to deal with. So I just spent years suppressing it all and pushing it away and so forth. And but the point came. I was at Jews College. I was thousands of miles from home on my own in a strange city in the hot summer of 1989, after the college year was finished, and I was sort of left to my own devices. And that's when everything sort of bubbled up, and I was in my mid-20s at that point, turning 26. And in my experience with lots of other people and lots of other young men that I've counseled over the years, that's when, you know, you have to get real. You have to start facing up to who you really are. And that's what happened with me. And I just, I felt I could no longer avoid the fact that this is who I was. But it was an awful experience, absolutely horrific. I got very, very depressed. The feelings of guilt and of uncleanness and everything, you know, became quite overwhelming. And so I sort of struggled on with that into the following year. I think that year when because in those days I used to go back for a visit home in the summer, the British summer, and I went home, and I think I told my sister something about what I was going through, and that was very helpful. We weren't that close, my sister and I, but we came much closer because of that. And just one sister, slightly younger. Anyway, so, and then in 1990, I moved out to Watford. I became the student rabbi at Watford United Synagogue, which was lovely community. But I was going through all kinds of, you know, internal struggles. And I got in touch with Rabbi Lionel Blue. I'm sure most people here have heard of Rabbi Lionel Blue.
Yes.
I first heard about him from some friendly friars that I met through a friend of mine in Australia, who knew him from retreats he used to go on at the Carmelite Friary in Oxford, because Lionel liked to mix up his religions quite a sort of fascinating way. And so this intriguing rabbi who went on retreats in Catholic friaries and so forth. And the year I came over to England was the year that he came out. A few months earlier, he'd come out publicly. So he was the first openly gay rabbi. Everybody who knew him had always known, but the general public listening to him on the radio hadn't. And I read his book, a wonderful book, one of his early books called A Back Door to Heaven, and I felt that this was someone I could really confide in, who would understand. And so I made contact with him, and I remember walking into his house in Finchley and being greeted by his lovely smiling face. He said, "Hello, Ducky," which was not how rabbis usually addressed me. So, and we became great friends, Lionel and I. And he was a tremendous help. He sent me straight to his therapist to start sorting myself out, and started introducing me. I knew nobody outside of the, you know, Northwest London Jewish kind of Orthodox world, you know. So he started introducing me to people who were from other worlds, as it were, and that was great. But it took me a while to do that, and I mean, I still didn't really know where I was headed, so I wasn't yet ready to give up on being an Orthodox rabbi, and it was all just a very confusing situation. And Lionel encouraged me to sort of press on and get through it and get smicha. You could accuse me of doing it in bad faith, I suppose, but I didn't really know what was going to happen at that point. I still wasn't ready to sever ties with Orthodox Judaism, and you know, I just didn't know. So it was all pretty fraught, I have to say, and I went through some quite tough times. I had a wonderful chavruta whom I studied with, and they pushed me through the smicha program quite fast because we were a bit ahead of the others and so forth. So it was a strange time to look back on. It's hard to almost seems like another life, you know. So I got smicha from the late Lord Jakobovitz in the early 1991. By the end of 1991, I knew that I had to leave Orthodox Judaism. December 1991, I read 2 books at the same time. I'm always reading several books at once, and I read a wonderful book by, oh, forgive me, that's my phone going, which should have switched off. A wonderful book by Judith Plaskow called Standing Again at Sinai. It's a feminist, a Jewish feminist theology. It was a very groundbreaking work. And that had a great effect on me. And at the very same time, I read The Color Purple by Alice Walker, which is also a great spiritual feminist novel. And the combination of those two books sort of liberated something in me. I'd been very tied to the traditional patriarchal idea of God as a lawgiver, as a judge, as, you know, you have to obey, and I hadn't been able to see anything beyond that. So other forms of Judaism hadn't really, you know, hadn't really figured for me. And then reading those books and realizing that there is a much better, more life-giving and truer way for me of thinking about God beyond that sort of patriarchal, law-giving, punitive paradigm, was immensely liberating. So I owe everything to feminism, really. That's whether I've repaid the debt in any way, I don't know, but I owe everything that happened to those feminist pioneers. And it was then that I decided I had to leave. So happened that in January 91, I got a message from the new chief rabbi, Jonathan Sachs, to come in and have a meeting with him. It was just a routine meeting that he had with all his ministers in the United Synagogue. So it was my turn. It was 9th of January 1991, one of those dates that you never forget. And but I knew that I was going to drop a bombshell on him. And I sat there in his study in Hamilton Terrace and said, I've got to tell you that I'm going to leave Watford, leave the United Synagogue. And that, so I came out to him, basically. I won't go through all the words that were said. He was ever so nice. He was very understanding. He was quite shocked, of course. It was just at this time, there were all kinds of controversies going on involving him. I don't know if people remember the first controversy of his chief rabbinate, which was probably didn't make an impact in Edinburgh because it's a long way from London, but it was all the Jewish organizations, all the synagogues, all the movements, every Jewish charity was invited to a charity walk around Hyde Park to raise money for good causes, and everybody would be welcome. And this was a great thing, that the chief rabbi was going to welcome everybody, liberal, reform, whatever. And the Jewish Lesbian and Gay Helpline, which was an important LGBT charity in London at the time, sent in their application to be in the walk and were refused. So the line was drawn at, at that. So this was a big controversy. All these things were going on at the time, and then there was me being a nuisance. So,
I'm sure you weren't a nuisance.
but he was very nice, because I said I'd also started teaching at Leo Beck College at that point. Not many people know, but Jonathan Sachs had also taught for Leo Beck College. Not at Leo Beck College, but he had Leo Beck College students coming to his home. This was some years previously. So he said, oh, I used to teach for them. And anyway, so he could have told me to pack my bags and be out by midnight, but he allowed me to work off my 6 months notice period at Watford and so forth. And that was very generous and very good of him, I suppose. Yeah. And then, so liberal Judaism. So I decided to leave, and I started applying for jobs elsewhere. I went to Masorti, but I was quickly told that they weren't ready for a gay rabbi at that point. Things have probably changed a lot now, but that was many years ago. And then I went to the Reform movement, and they sent me off to Southend for an interview. And I got a flat tire on the North Circular. which was probably an omen. And Southend were ever so nice, but they decided they didn't really want a rabbi at all. And people said to me, "Oh, don't bother with the liberals; they're too way out. You're too traditional. That won't be a good match." So I didn't even approach liberal Judaism. And then I was off in Australia later that summer, just at the point where the Jewish Chronicle outed me to the world at large. And so I thought, well, that's the end of my career then. And I got a call saying, "Oh, this small liberal synagogue has expressed interest in you." And it was a synagogue called West Central, right in the middle of London, in the West End, which had its shacharit, its morning service at 3 in the afternoon on a Saturday. So it was a slightly odd little congregation, and they were interested in me. So that's where I found myself at the end of 1992 as the part-time rabbi of West Central, teaching at Leobeck as well. And that was my introduction to liberal Judaism, and I was a bit nervous about it, but I very quickly found that it was the perfect religious home for me. It was just what I'd been looking for without knowing it, because it had not only the freedom, the liberal approach, but also a kind of intellectual rigor. The spiritual leader of liberal Judaism at that time was a wonderful man called Rabbi John Rayner, who was the emeritus rabbi of the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, and a great scholar. And I think it was the sort of the academic and intellectual tradition of liberal Judaism that helped me to feel at home there, and the presence of John Rayner. So he's another of those great people that I owe so much to.
Wow. I mean, what a fascinating story and journey.
Long story, I'm sorry.
No, it's really, really fascinating. I mean, I don't know about everyone else, but I knew a lot about you and your background and things, but I hadn't really heard the detail. I mean, obviously it was a very hard journey and an intense struggle for you. Do you think it's given you strength as a rabbi today?
I don't know about strength. I think the whole experience, what I felt at the time, and I suppose I still feel, is that whole experience of coming out through all of that, struggle and depression and so forth, made me a much more compassionate person. I think up to then, it was probably also callow youth, but I think because I was always being very, very hard on myself, I was probably being very hard on everybody else and a bit rigid in my ways of thinking. And I think I felt that I was becoming a much more compassionate person through that experience of being that vulnerable myself, and becoming part of what was then still somewhat marginalized minority, less so now, thank goodness, and helped me to be much more understanding and compassionate towards other people struggling with whatever it was they were. And just one thing I could add, if you don't mind, David, about, because you remember my struggles with Chabad were about the sort of exclusiveness that the Jews are something different from everybody else, which I really couldn't accept, because at that moment Rabbi Apple and the great synagogue and my whole upbringing had taught me that wasn't what Judaism was about. It was about responsibility, but not about being better than other people and so forth. So that I sort of reverted to that in going to Jews College, becoming a modern Orthodox rabbi. So that sort of solved a bit of it. But when I found liberal Judaism, one of the, I think, very distinctive things is that when we pray, we try to make our prayers more universalist. And I'm not here to push liberal Judaism, I'm just describing my own experience. So when you say Oseh Shalom Bimromav, Hu Yaseh Shalom Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael, that's the traditional one, yes? May God, who makes peace on high, make peace for us and for all Israel. And in liberal Judaism, we always add, and this goes back a long way, V'al Kol B'nei Adam, and for all humanity. So we pray for peace, not just for us and for all Israel, but for all humankind. And that came, on top of all of that I'd been going through all those years before. This came as a kind of wonderful liberation and validation, I suppose, that it is possible to be truly universalistic as a Jew and as a rabbi. So that was one of the reasons why I really cherish liberal Judaism and what it's done for me.
Thank you.
As well as the equality of men and women, because you remember the whole that feminist awakening with Judith Plaskow and Alice Walker. I know Alice Walker has some other problematic opinions, but I won't go into that. So coming to a movement where at that time liberal Judaism was debating, do we add Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah into the Siddur, as well as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? And I came in the midst of that debate when we were creating a new Siddur, which came out in 1995. So it was very exciting and very thrilling to be able to contribute to those sorts of discussions about gendered language and equality of men and women and so forth. So yeah,
So I mean, it's fascinating to hear about all that and in the time that it took place in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And today, I suppose a lot of people would feel that we embrace diversity more, and we certainly talk about it, and it's not such a, an elephant in the room, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think things have changed a lot? Do you think it's still very difficult within faiths?
Well, in some faiths it's very difficult. In the Church of England right now, it's blooming difficult for LGBT people. But in Judaism, thankfully, not quite so much. And things have, the change is tremendous. I'm someone who likes to take a long historical perspective on things. And in the historical perspective, the pace of change in the last, since the 1960s has been the speed of light. It's extraordinary how far things have gone. And I know for many people that's unsettling and worrying. And yesterday it was lesbian and gay, and now the whole trans debate and all of the strong feelings which I've become very aware of within my own community in Edinburgh, people's misgivings and so forth. So there's always something new to deal with. But I have to say that almost without exception, even within the Orthodox world, everyone has been always, right from the beginning, has always been understanding and kind. I've had nobody unpleasant to me. Rabbis I came out to before I was out to the world at large were lovely. Rabbi Apple struggled with it, I have to say. He was the first rabbi I came out to, and of course we had been so close, so that came as a terrible shock to him. But I won't go into the details of that conversation right now. But yeah, people were generally very gracious. There's been a huge change in Orthodox Judaism as well, even though the halakha doesn't change, can't change. It's not for me to say, but within the Orthodox sort of parameters. But as you say, the freedom with which people discuss things, the way people can be much more open about their identity, even within Orthodox communities. In other parts of the world, perhaps it's been a bit more dramatic than here in Britain. And we saw 2-3 years ago now the first openly gay rabbinic student, Orthodox rabbinic student, getting smicha. It was very controversial, and in the end, he didn't get smicha from the institution that had trained him, which had said it was going to give him smicha, so he had to go somewhere else. But that's the first time someone who's openly gay has become an Orthodox rabbi. Whether he's accepted as such, again, not for me to say, but was ordained by another Orthodox rabbi. So the world is changing fast, and in many ways, I think, for the better in those respects. And what's interesting is that in other religions, sexuality is a hot button issue, and it's the dividing line between all sorts of factions, and it's the test case on which, you know, things are made and broken. And that doesn't tend to be the case with us. It's an interesting question why. Judaism has just as strong a taboo historically of homosexuality, but there are other things that get Jews, you know, worked up nowadays. Things to do with Israel, perhaps, and so forth. But even within Israel itself, apart from, I mean, there is a I mean, now a very vocal fringe that's getting into power in Israel, which is openly homophobic, and that's very worrying for some of us. But even politically in Israel, it's not been the kind of dividing issue for Israeli society at large that it is in some other places, and that's certainly in the Islamic world. So that's good.
Well, moving on, I'm sure we could continue this part of the conversation for another few hours because it's been so fascinating. But I'd really like to talk about something else that can be divisive in shul or synagogue, and that is this singing tunes. And at this point, I want to talk about the cantorial side of your life and your work, and I know that you've got a beautiful singing voice, and I've always enjoyed hearing you sing leading prayers, but also to go to another level to singing Burns in Yiddish. And quite a few years ago now, I was really privileged to have you involved in a radio production of Bar Mitzvah Boy by Jack Rosenthal, adapted by his daughter Amy Rosenthal. And just to explain to everybody, I was producing this for Radio 4. And if anyone knows the television play, the very important part of it is set during Shachrit in Saturday morning in the synagogue, and in the background to everything was the service going on. So while young Elliot, who was having his bar mitzvah that day, was being encouraged by his grandfather, his father, and his sister's fiance, we hear the service in the background. And so I had to get someone that could lead the prayers, and we also assembled a kind of choir or congregation. And Mark, you were very, very helpful there, and a lifesaver for me as a producer. But where did your interest? Well, you said that you sang in the choir back in Sydney, but can you tell us a bit more about how you got interested in music? And
thank you. Well, yeah, I mean, I always loved singing. I was brought up. My father was a classical music lover, an opera lover, so I got that from him. My mother loved Gilbert and Sullivan and musicals and Al Jolson, and you know, and so I got all that as well. And I always loved singing. I was always my mother had sung all her life in the Great Synagogue, in the junior choir, which sang on Friday nights, and then in the senior choir, which sang on Shabbat morning, and of course on Yom Tov. And she'd been very involved for decades. She was the secretary of the choir, kept all the music, all the records, everything. And she was a contralto. She used to say she was a low woman. And as a child going to shul, I remember when I was a small child, we went every second week. So 1 week would stay at we didn't have a TV at home. We'd go over to my grandparents and watch the Saturday cartoons. And then other weeks we'd go to the shul. And I go up to the choir gallery. And in those days, the choristers wore mortarboards and big, heavy academic gowns, and sat up in the choir gallery above the Aron HaKodesh. And I used to go and wrap myself up in my mother's gown and feel very sort of cozy and lovely there. And the choir master, when I was a kid, was actually a relative. He was my father's cousin, a wonderful, wonderful man, a great musician, whom I became very, very close to as the years went by. And so I naturally joined the junior choir and for Friday nights, and sang Yigdal from the choir gallery, and sang Anim Zmirot from the Bima on Shabbat morning. and then in one of the conditions on which Rabbi Apple had come to Sydney, I think with instructions from the chief rabbi or something, was that the mixed choir had to go. Mixed choirs were no longer acceptable. And this was happening in Britain at the same time, and synagogues were being forced to get rid of their mixed choirs, which they'd had for forever, Hampstead Synagogue and others. And and so my mother and all the ladies were being turfed out of the choir to general, disapproval and disquiet, but it had to be. The rabbi said so. So they soldiered on with the men, who didn't make a particularly harmonious noise. So then they recruited some boys to sing the soprano line. So I was one of the first boys that joined the choir when I was around 11, and so I helped replace my mother in the choir, and my mother, of course, sat in the ladies' gallery and sang the contralto line as she always had. So I sang in the choir, learnt all the choral music. But because I was very keen and wanted to be frum and everything, so I started leading shacharit. I became the regular Baal Shacharit, and I loved the nusach. I loved all the melodies, and I picked it up. And then I started doing high holiday services, get cassettes from the chazan. We had one, as well as Rabbi Apple. There was a marvelous chazan whom we all called Reverend Gluck, Isidore Gluck, a most wonderful man, and a Holocaust survivor and everything. He was chazan in Dublin for a while. I think he was chazan in Finchley in London for a little while, and then he came out to Sydney back in the 60s, I guess. And so I learned all of his nusach, and he made tapes for me, and I learned the laning, and I became the Baal Koreh at the synagogue, the regular Torah reader. I think I did it every second week. And the Chazan Sheni, so I used to do shacharit on the holy days, and so forth. And I just went on from there. So it was always just a big part of what I did. I also sang lots of Gilbert and Sullivan. And yeah, so that and then everywhere I've been, I've picked up different musical styles. In Watford, I learned the Watford melodies. At the LJ, and I was rabbi for 9 years at the LJS, which is the big liberal, the cathedral of liberal synagogues in St. John's Wood in London, where they have a professional choir and an organ and everything. But they loved my singing as well, so I did lots of stuff with the choir there. So everywhere I've been, I've picked up bits and pieces. I've forgotten lots along the way, like you do. So yeah, it's just a big part of who I am. And I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect from what people have told me that in some ways I'm probably most myself when I'm singing, most expressive. And I think I can be a bit forbidding sometimes in other contexts, but when I'm singing, I'm just sort of giving out, and I love it. And as long as my voice will last, I turn 60, please God, this year. So at some point it'll go, and what I'll do then, I don't know, but I'll carry on till then.
Maybe not. Maybe
Voice
is just mature, and
if I'm very lucky,
like a good whiskey,
Yeah.
But have you ever gone to a congregation and at first there's been a reaction against you bringing in new tunes? And
no, that's an interesting question. I know at the LJS, I've got to tell a funny little story. So at the LJS, in classical liberal Judaism, the Torah isn't chanted, it's just read. The rabbi reads in a normal reading voice and translates as they go from the scroll. And that's what liberal Jews had done for generations. And but I was invited. I wasn't employed there at that stage, but I was invited as a guest preacher one Shabbat to the LJS. First time. It was a great honor, great experience. And they'd asked me, the rabbis had asked me if I'd chant from the scroll. So I did. And one member of the congregation got up in indignation and walked out very demonstratively and said, "This isn't liberal Judaism. You're dragging us back to the Middle Ages." I'm happy to say that we later became good friends, and that person's son is now a Masorti rabbi. So, his grandfather was the president of liberal Judaism, a grandee of classical liberalism, and his grandson is now a Masorti rabbi, which is lovely. And I did his wedding as well. So so yeah, it's interesting. So apart from that, I wasn't allowed to sing too much. I was limited to one thing per service, I think, at the LJS, or was, or it would be too much like having a chazan, which wasn't what they wanted. So I was allowed to do one thing per service. At West Central, which was the first liberal synagogue, they already had a chazan. So I had to be very careful not to tread on his toes and be kind of, hold myself back. And I did for a long time, but I think at some point he got to resent me a little bit. So, other places, not so much. I think people have generally, if you sing too many new things in one service, people get perturbed and they can't join in. So you've got to learn to do things gradually. And then at Sukkot Shalom, I've introduced, well, lots of new things, I suppose, but I try to do things a number of times so people get to know them. And once you've done things for 1 year, it becomes tradition. And, I'll let the members who are here comment if they want to. But I think that I've been very fortunate and people have been very receptive. I know that my service is perhaps a bit different from your average, progressive service, with a bit more singing and chanting and so forth. But I think a lot of people quite like that. In any case, within progressive Judaism, as within all branches of Judaism, there's been a sort of swing back towards tradition. If you'd gone to a liberal service in the 1950s, there would have been hardly any Hebrew. And the choir would sing a couple of things in Hebrew, and they'd sing hymns in English and so forth. And that's all changed quite drastically throughout the liberal movement. So I've just been part of that trend, I guess. And now the students at Leo Beck, I started teaching cantillation, so laning, chanting from the Torah at Leo Beck College many years ago. And it was sort of optional, so students could come or not come. But now it's a compulsory part of the course. All the students learn to lane. They all go to the synagogues where they minister and they lane, or the bat mitzvah children lane, and it's now the thing to do.
Very good, and that kind of brings me on to the next thing that I was going to ask you about. Obviously, your main job is being senior lecturer at the college, but you're also a part-time rabbi to two communities. That's a lot to fit in, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a lot it's a bit too much to fit in, and it means emails don't get answered promptly, and phone calls don't get made promptly, and I struggle on and try to give everyone their due. And certainly in terms of the amount of time it takes up, the college is my main employer, certainly. At the moment, I teach effectively 2 days a week at Leo Beck. And I teach several different courses, as you kindly said in the introduction, and I love it. I think apart from singing, teaching is the thing I love doing most. And one of the things I have to say that I count myself most fortunate in having sort of stumbled into being the rabbi of Sukkot Shalom in Edinburgh is that Sukkot Shalom is, of all congregations that I've known, the most receptive and enthusiastic about learning and study. And okay, not everybody, and met people, not many different things out of their congregation, but I've been able to lead philosophy study groups and Talmud study groups for years and years now for Sukkot Shalom, and other people from elsewhere have joined in once COVID came and everything went online, so people from anywhere could participate. And but having a community that wants to learn that way is the greatest gift any rabbi can have, I think. And I've been extremely fortunate in that shidduch with Sukkot Shalom.
So obviously an Edinburgh community and a Leicester community, two very different cities.
Mm-hmm.
Are there very different things about each community that strike you?
Yes, they are different, of course. And while I'm happy to say Sukkot Shalom is on a growth trajectory, people coming and joining. There could always be more, but it has been growing. Sadly, Leicester, like so many of the smaller Jewish communities around Britain, is going the other way. And just in the last couple of years, sadly, people have been not leaving the community, but leaving Leicester, moving away one reason or another. So that's something to be concerned about, and trying to build up numbers and gather people. It's not just Leicester, it's people from all around the East Midlands. We have people from Northamptonshire to Derbyshire. So Leicester perhaps is maybe doesn't have quite the same impetus for prolonged discussions of Maimonides and Spinoza as some people at Sukkot Shalom enjoy. But what Leicester does have, some of you who may know about Leicester know it's one of the most multicultural cities in the UK. The huge Hindu and Muslim and Sikh communities, and the lovely thing in Leicester is the way in which there's this sort of sense of interfaith. We have that in many ways in Edinburgh as well, but it's a particular highlight in Leicester, and the desire for that sort of, and for social action involvement as well. In the Sukkot Shalom, when the one thing we don't have at the moment is, of course, our own synagogue that belongs to us. So we're very lucky in where we do meet, and it's a great place for us, but it's not our own. Leicester has a small synagogue, but it's their own, and they had before COVID. They used to participate in a winter night shelter program where homeless people would come and literally sleep in the synagogue one night a week. Other nights they'd be in churches or Hindu and Muslim centers. And just lately in the cold snap, we had the synagogue opened one day a week through January as a warm space where people could come in out of the cold if they were struggling to heat their homes. And the synagogue threw its doors open for that. So this is just some of the examples of the sorts of things that Leicester does beautifully.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thanks for taking the time this evening to join this conversation. And to everybody that's been watching on Zoom, thank you for coming along as well. If you'd like to hear more about Edinburgh Jewish Cultural Centre activities and events, please go to our website, which is www.jcc.scot. Thank you very much. Good night.